So I was really glad to be able to go into the Kerry James Marshall exhibit with you guys and take a look at some of the things that were happening inside that exhibit on Friday. And I'm sorry that this podcast is a little bit late, but um, I think that I wanted to include a little bit of the conversation that he is having, right? And we talked when we were at the museum on Friday about some of the artifacts that are inside the entrance to the exhibit that are not necessarily work of Marshall himself, but include Gardner's art through the ages, right, which is a sort of Stockstad equivalent text. And one of the reasons why we move away from the Stockstad for this particular class is because of the fact that there's a lot of effort made in the Stockstad to try and neutralize the narrative that they're telling, and that makes it seem like it's not a biased narrative, or at least it gives the appearance of not being a biased narrative. But I think it's better to use texts like the Hopkins that are definitely coming from a viewpoint of history and are definitely presenting a certain vantage point. This is a point that Kerry James Marshall emphasized inside the exhibition, and something that I think that we have a tendency to forget when we're talking about art. We talked about inside class this idea of masculinity and the pushback that Hopkins is demonstrating is happening is primarily still from a white male viewpoint, right? The artists that are being talked about are still from this sort of vantage point. So the reason why that's important, and the reason why it's important to point out that Hopkins is still talking about white males, white American males, is that it's a lot easier to hide it, or at least during this time period, it's a lot easier to hide your sexuality than it is to not be a woman or not be black, right? It's a lot easier to pass. And passing is something that makes it a lot easier to sort of deconstruct the narrative from what appears to be the inside. So somebody like Jasper Johns, it's a lot easier to get recognition and to hide yourself than it is for somebody like, for instance, David Hammons. Now, the slide that we're looking at here, if we look at this image, this is just a close-up of Jasper Johns' flag, which I wanted you to see to give you an idea of sort of the textural quality of these images, as well as that you really can see the newspaper and the text sort of coming through these things, right? And here on the right, this image is another Jasper Johns flag. And the point of this one is supposed to be that you stare at it, and then when you close your eyes, supposedly this creates in the negative image in your closed eyes, you'll see an actual American flag, red, white, and blue, right? So that's Jasper Johns. Now, there's an artist that we're going to be talking a little bit about as well, named David Hammons, who directly sort of sets himself up against a lot of the artists that Hopkins talks about inside his text, and is central to one of the last texts that we're going to be looking at inside this class, which is Darby English's How to See a Work of Art in Total Darkness. He begins making work in the 1960s, and this is his work down at the bottom, which is the African American flag, or I think it's the Pan-African American flag, which deals with the which deals with the colors of Pan-Africanism, as well as sort of presents a political context that is slightly different to what Jasper Johns is critiquing. So he's critiquing Jasper Johns in addition to critiquing the American flag, right? So that's one of his images. The other thing is that, so this is Marcel Duchamp on the left, In Advance of a Broken Arm. And this is David Hammons on the right, Spade with Chains from 1973. So what's interesting to me is that this chapter is on Duchamp, and the chapter talks about the fact that there's this idea of sort of traditional masculinity that's happening, and he talks about people like Sherry Levine and Gober, I think it's Gober, right, who are in conversation with Marcel Duchamp, but he does not mention David Hammons, who is also, through Spade with Chains, having a conversation about ready-mades and the art and the difference between these two objects and sort of their cultural connotations are significant, right? The fact that Hopkins does not encounter David Hammons at all is also significant, because there's a certain narrative that Hopkins is espousing that ignores a vantage point up until he identifies that vantage point as being rooted inside identity art, which he's going to do in a later chapter. And what this says about how Hopkins feels about Black art in particular, and art that is not from a white male perspective, it's very interesting that that is how he sort of presents it and poses it. And I would think that someone like Kerry James Marshall would express that that's problematic, that this narrative that he's presenting excludes somebody so completely, until it becomes time to talk about issues of identity. And that is in part what the Darby English reading is going to be talking about. So that's just something for you guys to think about in relation to what we talked about in this chapter and the work that we saw on Friday. So I'm going to leave you guys with that, and I will see you guys on Tuesday. Remember, there's no reading for this week, but there is inside the discussion section for week 4, there is a response that you need to respond to. So you need to do an initial response to the question of 250 words, and then you need to comment on at least 2 other people's response. All right, thank you guys.